Bid 8 cents for an abandoned mill, pregnant bride hiding in the loft. The auctioneer's voice was already moving past me when I raised my hand. 8 cents, that's what I said. 8 cents for the Harrow Mill, the one that sat dead on the Calvert Creek bend, wheel rotted half off, roof sagging on the east side like a man who'd given up standing straight. Everybody in that courthouse yard laughed. Not mean laughter, just the kind men make when something is too small to take seriously. The county clerk wrote it down anyway because nobody else had bid a thing, and that was that. I walked away with a deed to a ruin, and a mule named Ches who didn't care either way. My name is Elias Cutter. I was 53 years old that October, and I had been a railroad man for 26 of those years, a tamper, a tie-layer, a bridge carpenter, then a foreman, until the line I'd given my back to decided that younger men with less to say could do the same work cheaper. They weren't wrong about cheap. They might have been wrong about the other part. I had a little money saved and a specific idea: fix the mill, grind grain for the farms along the Calvert corridor, become useful again. Not rich, useful. There is a difference, and at 53 I understood it in a way I hadn't at 30. I had been a widower for 4 years. My wife Clara had died of a fever the spring before I was let go, and if I am being honest, losing the railroad 6 months later hadn't landed as hard as it might have because there wasn't much left in me to bruise. I am not telling you this for pity. I am telling you because you need to understand what a man who has already lost his main things is willing to risk. 8 cents was nothing to me. The mill was something. I drove out to the property the afternoon of the auction. October light, long and flat, the kind that makes everything look a little more finished than it is. The mill pond had silted up on one end but was still mostly sound. The wheel was worse than I'd thought. 2 of the paddles were entirely gone and the axle had rusted through at the collar, but the stone itself, the big French burr inside, was whole. I walked my hand around its face in the dimness of the mill floor and felt the dressed furrows still sharp. That stone could work. Everything else I could fix. I went upstairs. Not for any particular reason. I just wanted to see what the loft was like, whether the floor was solid enough to store grain sacks. The stair was a fixed ladder really, spiked to the wall. I went up it and put my head through the opening, and there she was. She was sitting in the far corner with her back against the wall and a horse blanket pulled up over her knees, and she had a shotgun leveled at my face from about 12 feet away. She was young, 20, maybe 22, and she was plainly, clearly, heavily pregnant. Her face was pale and her eyes were dry, and I could see from the way she held that gun that she'd thought through whether she would use it. I said, "That's my mill." She said it was abandoned. I said, "It was this morning. I bought it this afternoon." She didn't lower the gun. I didn't come any further up the ladder. We stayed like that for a moment, and I could hear the creek outside and a red-tailed hawk somewhere over the water meadow screaming. I said, "I'm not going to do anything to you. I need you to believe that." She studied me a long time. Then she lowered the gun to her lap, not all the way down, just to her lap. Her name was Nora Vaugh. She'd been married in Chadwell, 7 miles east, to a man named Orrin Vaugh who had taken her money, her father's inheritance, which she'd brought to the marriage, and then left for Colorado Territory with a woman from a saloon in Tull. She'd found out she was pregnant about 2 weeks after he rode out. She'd stayed in Chadwell another month, trying to hold her head up, but a woman with no husband and a growing belly and no money and no family within 4 states is not welcome to hold her head up for long. She'd packed what she could carry and walked. She'd found the mill 10 days ago. She'd been eating hardtack and dried venison from a hunter's pack she'd found hanging in the mill room. She didn't know whose it was and didn't much care, and drinking from the creek and waiting to figure out what to do next. The baby, she figured, was 6 or 7 weeks off. I told her she could stay until she figured something out. I said it simply, like it was just a fact of the situation, which is how I believe you have to say things when someone is frightened and proud and doesn't want to be handled. I went back down the ladder, got my bedroll from the wagon, and laid it out on the mill floor below. I slept under the millstone that first night with the sound of her moving around very carefully up above me, trying not to make noise, and I thought about Clara, who had been practical and unafraid, and had never once in 18 years made me feel small. I thought that this young woman in the loft had a similar kind of spine. You can tell. In the morning she came down and made a fire in the rusted iron stove without asking me. She had found flour somewhere, I still don't know where, and she made pan bread and set a piece on the edge of the stove nearest me without a word. That was the arrangement for a while. I worked. She cooked what there was to cook and did what she could do. We ate and didn't talk much. She was not a woman who needed to fill silence, which I respected. I want to tell you about the work, because this is the part that matters to how the whole thing went. I had carpentered bridges on 3 different railroads, and I knew timber and I knew stone, and I knew what a structure needed to stand, and what it needed to do its job. I spent the first week on the wheel, pulled the rusted axle collar with a drift punch, and a piece of iron bar I'd brought in the wagon, fitted a new collar I'd had cast at the foundry in Marston before I'd even bid on the place, rehung 2 new paddles I'd cut from white oak and shaped with a drawknife. The wheel turned on the 3rd try. Not smooth, not yet, but it turned. I heard Nora come out of the mill and stand on the bank watching it, and I didn't look back, but I heard her. The mill race needed clearing. 3 days on my knees in cold water, pulling silt and deadfall. My hands were ruined by the end of each day, but they were an old ruin. They'd looked that way for 20 years. She met me at the door the 3rd evening with a basin of hot water and sat across from me while I soaked them, and she didn't make anything of it, just sat there mending a seam on her dress by lamplight. That was the first time I thought about it. Not thought about it the way a younger man might. I don't mean that. I mean I thought, this is someone worth something. This is someone who deserved better than she got. October ran out and November came in hard. First snow hit the 2nd week, early even for the Calvert country, and I was still sleeping on the mill floor, which was cold enough that I could see my breath in the mornings. I'd told Nora I'd find other arrangements for myself once I had the place habitable. She hadn't said anything to that. There was a small room off the back of the mill that had been the miller's quarters, a wood stove, a rope bed frame, a window that had lost its shutter. I put the shutter back, fitted a new rope on the bed frame, got the stove drawing. I moved her in there on a Thursday. She stood in the doorway of it and ran her hand along the edge of the stove the way I'd run my hand along the millstone that first afternoon, testing it, feeling what was real. She said, "You didn't have to do this." I said, "You needed a room that wasn't a loft." She looked at me for a moment, and then she went in and set her things on the bed, and I went back to work on the gear train. There was a man in Chadwell named Pell who had been to the auction and seen me bid. He came out to the mill in November, riding a good gray horse and wearing the kind of coat that cost more than most men made in a month, and he stood in the yard and watched me work for a while without speaking. Then he said he'd buy the mill from me for $20, which was considerably more than 8 cents, and also considerably less than what the property was worth once the wheel was running. I didn't stop working while he talked. I was fitting the brake lever on the stone nut, and it required some attention. He said $40. I said no. He said he knew about the woman I'd taken in. He said the town had an opinion about it. I set down the brake lever and I looked at him. I am not a large man, I never was, but I have been working hard since I was 14 years old, and I am put together in a way that shows it. And I was looking at him from the inside of what was mine, and I think he read the situation correctly, because he didn't say the next thing he was going to say. He turned the gray horse around and rode back toward town. That was the last I heard from Pell about the mill. The grinding mechanism came together the last week of November. I had the stone dressed twice by then and the gear train running clean and the hopper repaired. And when I fed the first grain through, a small sack of rye I'd bought from the Alderman farm 2 miles north, and that stone turned and the meal came down into the trough below, I put my hand in it and felt how fine it was, and I stood there in the noise of the wheel and I thought, good, just that, good. Nora had come in without me hearing her. She was standing at the edge of the light from the open door, and she was watching me stand there with meal on my hand, and she was smiling. Not a big smile, the kind that is real. She said, "It works." I said, "It works." She came and put her hand in the meal trough beside mine. She was very large by then, and she moved carefully, and the lamplight was on her and on the meal and on the old stone turning above us, and the whole mill was alive for the first time in however many years it had been dead. And I thought, this is what I came here for. Not exactly this, but this. The baby came on December the 9th. I want to be honest about what that night was like. I'm not a man who has delivered a child. I never had children with Clara. That was one of the griefs we carried. And what I knew about it was limited to what I'd seen with livestock, which is useful up to a point, and then not useful at all. Nora had been in labor since afternoon. I had ridden to Marston for the doctor at noon when I could see how things were going, and the doctor had ridden back with me, and he was with her in the back room. I was outside in the cold, splitting wood we didn't need split. The doctor came out at 3 in the morning and told me she'd had a boy and they were both fine. I sat down on the chopping block in the snow and I stayed there for a while. The doctor looked at me and didn't say anything, which showed good judgment. I went in at first light. Nora was awake, propped up on the rope bed with the baby wrapped and lying on her arm. She looked at me from across the room and I stopped in the doorway. The baby was very small and very red and he was making small sounds that weren't crying, just the sounds of being new. She said, "Come look." I went and looked. He had dark hair, just a little of it, and his face was scrunched up like he had an opinion about everything already. She said, "I'm going to call him Elliot." I didn't say anything. I thought about how one letter off that was from my own name, and I decided it was probably just a name she liked and not anything else. She said, "Sit down, Elias." I pulled the chair over and sat, and she shifted the baby and put him in my arms. He weighed nothing. He weighed everything. I held him and I didn't look at Nora for a while because I was working on keeping my face the way I wanted it. When I looked up, she was watching me with the baby, and her face was open in a way it hadn't been before, no guard in it, no caution, and she said, "You are a good man. I need you to know that I see that." I don't have anything to add to that. She said it, and it was true, and I'd needed it said, though I hadn't known until it was. Spring came. The Alderman farm brought their winter wheat. The Dewey's brothers brought corn. Old Peterson, who'd been hauling his grain 30 miles to the mill in Tull for 15 years, came out with 2 wagon loads and stood in the yard watching the wheel turn, and he shook my hand and said he wished he'd thought to bid on the place himself. I told him 8 cents seemed to have been the right number. He laughed. Nora ran the tally book. She had a clear head for figures, which I'd suspected, and she kept the accounts in a ledger she'd bought in Marston with the first real earnings the mill made. She didn't ask me if she could do it. She just started doing it, and she did it better than I would have. Elliot slept in a box near the stove while she worked, and then he didn't sleep much and she worked with him on her arm, and then he learned to sit up and he sat on the floor near her feet and watched everything with those dark eyes. I added a proper room to the back of the mill that April, 2 windows, a real bed, not a rope frame. I did it on Sundays, working by myself mostly, though Nora held boards and handed tools and told me when a thing wasn't level. She had good eyes. She told me straight, and I fixed it straight. There was an evening in May. I remember it was warm enough to have the mill door open, and the light was coming off the water the way it does in May, turning everything honey-colored. And Nora was in the yard with Elliot on the ground in front of her, and she was watching him try to grab a stick. And I was working the brake on the stone from inside, adjusting it. And I looked out through the open door, and I could see them there in the honey light, and I stood for a moment and just looked. She turned her head and saw me watching. She didn't say anything. She held my eyes for a long moment, long enough that it meant something, and then she went back to Elliot. I went back to the brake. The question between us had been sitting there since winter. Neither of us had named it. I was 53 and she was 22, and she had been used badly by a man she'd trusted, and I was not going to be another man who pushed his way into what she had not yet decided. But I want to tell you what she said the day she did decide. It was a Tuesday in June. I was at the wheel making an adjustment to the bearing housing, and she came and stood beside me, not in front of me, just beside me, and she said, "I want to stay." I said, "All right." She said, "I want to stay, and I want you to know that, not because I have nowhere else, because this is where I want to be." I looked at her. She looked back at me, and there was nothing in her face that needed anything from me except to be believed. She wasn't asking for rescue or gratitude or reassurance. She was making a declaration. A free woman with her own will, saying a plain thing. I said, "Then stay." She turned back toward the mill. I went back to the bearing housing. We married in July in the Marston church, which was small and spare and smelled of pine. Elliot sat on old Peterson's knee in the front pew and grabbed at Peterson's hat, and Peterson let him. The aldermans were there, the Dewey's brothers, a handful of others, nobody from Chadwell. I have heard it said in the years since that I was the one who saved her. People like a story where there's a rescue, and they'll build one even from material that doesn't quite fit. The preacher in Marston told it that way once at some dinner with me sitting right there. I didn't argue with him. It wasn't worth the breath. But I'll tell you how it was. She found that mill before I did. She made something out of nothing in the time it took me to fix the wheel. She ran the books, she held the boards level, she told me when something wasn't right, and she was always correct. She looked at a broke-down man sleeping on a mill floor, and she saw something worth staying for, and she said so. And I will tell you, there is no harder thing for a man to believe after enough years of loss and quiet and the world telling him he's done. There is no harder thing than a good woman looking at him with clear eyes and saying, "I see what you are. I choose this." Not because she has to, because she wants to. We are in the mill now. It's been 11 years, and the stone is still true, and the creek still runs, and Elliot is tall and learning the gear train alongside me. Nora is in the back room with the lamp on and the ledger open, and I can see the light under the door and hear her pencil moving. The wheel turns outside in the dark. The whole valley knows this mill, knows this family, knows my name. I think about that October afternoon sometimes, the auctioneer already moving past, 8 cents. The thing about a man bidding 8 cents on a ruin is that everybody in the yard thought he was getting nothing. Maybe so. I thought I was getting a chance to be useful again. That's all I thought. I got more than that.